Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to our lab notes session. My name is Josie, and I'm part of the public engagement team here at Alzheimer's Research UK. And I'm just going to share some slides with you for my introduction this afternoon. So I'm delighted to welcome you to the first event in our Lab Notes online series for 2023. Today, we are hearing from Dr. Chris Hardy and Dr. Eithne Heffernan. They will share the current knowledge and research into the links between hearing loss and dementia. But first, before we get started, I'll just go over a little bit of housekeeping before the event today. So during the event, you should be able to switch on the automatic subtitles using the CC button, which should be showing at the bottom of your screen. So these aren't 100% accurate during the live event today. However, Zoom is getting better and better at live subtitles, just that sometimes in these kind of events, it can't quite pick up all of our scientific terms that our speakers might be using. So we will make sure that these subtitles are correct and edited on the event recording when we put that live on YouTube. And we can also send a transcript out of the event from today as well. During the event, if you'd like to ask a question, you need to click the Q&A button, which should also be at the bottom of your screen. You can then type your question in the Q&A box, and please do this throughout the whole event. We will answer as many of these questions as we can in the Q&A session after the talks. If you are having any technical difficulties today, you can use the Q&A button to let our team know as well. So just before we get started as well, we're going to ask you a few poll questions, because while we can't see you due to the online format of today's event, we're really keen to know a little bit more about you. So hopefully those questions should be appearing on your screen any second. And these ask you to rate your reasons for attending today, to rate your current knowledge of dementia research, and whether you've attended one of our lab note sessions before. So if you could complete those questions now, and then we can share those answers with you on the screen in a second. So the first question is, how would you rate your current knowledge of dementia research? And question 2 is, which of these best describes your reasons for attending this event? And question 3, is this your first dementia research event? Have you maybe been to one of our lab notes events before, or is this the first time you're joining us? So I'll just give a couple of seconds for those answers to come in, and then we'll share those with you. So you should be able to see those answers on your screen now. So lots of people rating their knowledge as average, which is great. Hopefully you might be able to learn something today. A real variety of reasons why people have joined us, which is brilliant. Welcome, everyone. And a few people haven't been before, so welcome to everyone who's not joined us at a Lab Notes event before. So normally I give a really quick introduction at these events, and it's just a really quick one from me today, just one slide. And that's to say happy birthday to Lab Notes. So today is our 20th event that we've ran in this format. So Lab Notes started back in 2021 to showcase the amazing research taking place across the country whilst we couldn't get out and about at our normal in-person events. And the series has continued to grow from strength to strength, and we continue to discuss a variety of fascinating topics. I've just highlighted a few of those on the screen there, and you can go back and watch all of our previous events from the past 2 years over on our website. So thank you for being here today to support our series. And also I'd just like to say a massive thank you to the team working behind the scenes to bring these events to you. So today, our speakers will be talking about the links between hearing loss and dementia. Once we've heard the talks, I will return to the screen and we'll move to the Q&A session. As I said, you can submit these questions at any point during the event, and we'll try to answer as many as we can in the time that we have. Just to say that we can't provide clinical advice in response to questions about your individual situations. So please do get in touch with our Dementia Research info line or your GP if you have specific or personal questions, or just need a bit more guidance or support on where to turn. So we'll be hearing from Chris first, followed by Eithne. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Chris Hardy from University College London. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Josie. Just going to share my slides. Okay, so hi everyone, it's a great pleasure to be here today. I'm a senior postdoctoral scientist working in Professor Jason Moran's research team, and we're based in the Dementia Research Centre, which is in Queen Square in London, which is pictured here. Just to start, I thought it would be helpful to set the context of the sort of the problem that we face. And so there are 12 million adults in the UK who have hearing loss and nearly 1 million who have dementia. And what that means realistically is that every single person watching this and taking part today will know at least one person with hearing loss and or dementia. Now, since I started working in this area, which is now around 10 years ago, it started to get more and more attention. And what's been quite interesting is that these findings have transcended the way that scientists traditionally share results with one another, which is via quite dry, if I'm being honest, academic journal articles. And so here I've tried to depict what I hope is a relatively politically balanced spread of headlines from various newspapers highlighting this relationship between hearing loss and dementia. So how can we understand hearing loss and dementia risk? Well, there are many theories as to how the two may be related, and I wanted to briefly highlight three of these before focusing in on the one that I work on most. Now, the first theory is that hearing changes somehow cause dementia, the idea being perhaps that if we develop problems with the hearing in our ear, this causes the damaging proteins that we see in dementia to emerge, which take hold in the brain, which is what I'm showing there in that right-hand image, in the orange highlights on this image on the right-hand side. Let's move on to a second possible theory then. And here the idea is that perhaps hearing changes are linked to dementia through a different mechanism. So for example, perhaps somebody who struggles to hear people speaking in noisy environments might start to avoid social situations altogether. And we know that social connection is important in protecting against dementia. So is it possible that we have this indirect link between hearing loss, reduced social connection, and dementia? Another possible example here would be if somebody has difficulties hearing people speaking in noisy situations, but perhaps they have to concentrate extra hard to hear what is being said. And perhaps that act of extra concentration somehow reduces the other brain resources that they have, which might in turn mean that the person makes mistakes when it comes to other aspects of thinking. But to turn this on its head, what if we have this the whole way around altogether? And what if it's not that hearing changes cause dementia directly or indirectly, but rather that if you have a kind of dementia, you might see hearing problems emerging as a very early or perhaps even the very earliest symptom? So how would this work? Well, on the left-hand side of this slide, I've put what I called a map of hearing. This is quite complex. I've taken it from one of our scientific papers, but essentially this is just a drawing of the healthy brain, and where you can see different colors. These represent different parts, different aspects of hearing that the brain is involved in, and the different letters are shorthand terms for different brain regions. But the take-home message here is that the different colors are all different areas, brain areas, that are working to help our brains to hear sounds. Now, on the right-hand side, I've put some brain scans that we've done with people with different forms of dementia. And here I've used heat maps to highlight the areas that are most damaged in these different dementia subtypes. And really the point that I want to make here is that when you compare across the cartoon drawing on the left with the maps of dementia on the right, those real brains with that damage highlighted, I don't think it should be any surprise at all that dementia causes problems with hearing. And furthermore, I think we can actually start to make some quite specific predictions about the types of hearing problems that people with different forms of dementia will have based on what we know about these two maps. So I want to briefly share some of our own research now, and I've got 3 studies that I'd like to talk you through. What I've done at the bottom of each of these slides is to include sort of a take-home message. So if you miss what I say or just want to tune out for a little bit as I show some graphs, feel free to do that and just take in what I've written in that take-home message box at the bottom. So in this first study, we wanted to try to explore something that people with Alzheimer's disease were telling us. And what they were telling us was that they had particular problems hearing a single person in a noisy environment. So for example, the dinner table scene that is shown here, you can see that there are lots of people talking, even some musicians playing in the background, is a very noisy scene. And it's actually a really difficult problem for even the healthy brain to manage, how to focus in and to make sense of a single person talking, a single stream of speech from all of that background noise. So a former colleague of mine called Dr. Joe Gold designed a new test of complex hearing that would allow us to investigate this in a controlled environment. And Joe asked people without dementia and people with Alzheimer's disease to do this task. And her results supported what the people with Alzheimer's disease had been telling us, that the people with Alzheimer's had disproportionate difficulties compared to the people without dementia. And that's what you can see on this graph here. So a higher score is better. So you can see that the Alzheimer's disease group, who are depicted in white on that graph, are doing worse than those without dementia. And actually, we extended this research a few years later to include a group of people with posterior cortical atrophy. And this was work that was led by Dr. Ki Yong. And for those of you who don't know, posterior cortical atrophy is a rare dementia that affects vision. But again, people with this condition were reporting anecdotally that they're also really struggling to hear in noisy environments. And again, the results endorse this. And actually, quite surprisingly, you can see that people with this condition are performing even worse than the group of people with Alzheimer's disease, despite the fact that this is widely thought to be a sort of a visual-led form of dementia. So the next study I want to tell you about involves people with a different condition, a different type of dementia, which is known as frontotemporal dementia. And again, this is a rarer dementia, and it can affect behavior and language. And the people who participated in this study had a language variant of frontotemporal dementia. And here we found that actually people with this condition needed sounds to be played much louder in order to hear them than people without dementia or people with Alzheimer's disease. And that's what this graph is showing. So the bigger the bar, the louder that group needed sounds to be played to hear them on average. And so you can see that the yellow bar, which represents people with frontotemporal dementia, is much higher than the bar for people with Alzheimer's disease or for those participants without dementia. And again, this reflected what people were telling us, and actually what we had observed as well in support group meetings, where people with this condition would be asking the person speaking almost to shout in order to be heard, even in an otherwise quiet room. So we were keen to understand more about the reasons for this. So we took participants with frontotemporal dementia into a brain scanning study and asked them to wear headphones whilst they were in the scanner. And we played them a variety of different sounds. And what we found was that regardless of the sound that was played, so whether it was voices or environmental sounds, people with the language variant of frontotemporal dementia showed this abnormal brain activity compared with the volunteers without dementia. So they showed reduced activation in the brain's primary hearing centers, which I've shown on this on the right-hand side of this slide here. So suggesting that these problems with the loudness at which people with this condition need to hear sounds, that problem is related to underlying brain changes. And the third and final study I wanted to mention briefly to you is this work that has been carried out by Dr. Jess Zhang. And during the pandemic, Jess managed to pivot her research to take place over the telephone and over Zoom. And the first thing that Jess noticed was that both of these methods actually slightly distort the high quality speech that we hear if there's a single person talking in a quiet room. So as you're listening to me now, my voice has actually been slightly compressed. Your brains are working harder to hear me than they would be if we were face to face. The second thing that Jess noticed was that the people with Alzheimer's disease she was speaking to were having difficulties understanding her over the telephone or over Zoom, whereas her impression was that they hadn't had those same difficulties speaking to her in person. So Jess developed a new task to try to explore this in a controlled lab environment, and she took recordings of somebody saying a 3-digit number and added different amounts of distortion to these, and the people who took part in the study just had to repeat the number that they heard. And Jess was looking at how well her participants were able to repeat those numbers with those different levels of distortions. And we called those different levels channels. You can see that shown on the left-hand side. what she found was that, as you might expect, based on what I've told you so far, the people with Alzheimer's disease had more difficulties with the distorted speech than people without dementia. And what's potentially quite exciting about that finding is that when Jess analysed the results statistically, she found that when using a standard memory test, she was able to identify whether a participant had a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease or not with around, with 79% accuracy. But when she used her new complex hearing task instead, this accuracy rose to 90%, which is potentially really exciting. So why is it exciting? Well, I want us to take a step back and to think about what happens in the process of a dementia like Alzheimer's disease. To help here, I'm going to ask you to stay with me and to imagine that this iceberg represents a dementia like Alzheimer's disease. I also want you to imagine that that icebergs form from the bottom up, and you may at this point have some very reasonable suspicions about me not being a glaciologist, but I hope it's a helpful analogy. On the left-hand side, I'm going to put some of the key processes in the course of Alzheimer's disease. So we might put the emergence of symptoms at the level of the water, but actually we know that Alzheimer's disease starts to take hold in the brain years, perhaps even decades before symptoms emerge, starting with damaging proteins forming, which ultimately lead to brain shrinkage, which ultimately manifests in those symptoms at the level of the water, as we discussed. On the right-hand side, I'm going to put some of the ways in which we can measure these elements on the left. So to look for damaging proteins, we can use protein tests from blood or spinal fluid. To look for brain shrinkage, we can use brain scans. And we already have memory tests which can detect problems perhaps even slightly before somebody develops symptoms of the disease. And protein tests and brain scans are going to be hugely important in future when drugs like lecanemab become available that might be able to halt a dementia like Alzheimer's disease in its tracks. Then it's likely that the earlier somebody receives that medication, the greater its effect will be. And both of those tests might be able to pick up problems, in the case of proteins, perhaps 10, 15 years before symptom onset. But what they don't show is how close to developing symptoms a person might be. And that's where we're now wondering if tests of complex hearing might be able to fit in. So given that we know that dementias affect parts of the hearing brain early on in the disease course, as we've seen, and B, that complex hearing tasks are incredibly difficult even for the healthy brain, we're wondering if these very specific tests of complex hearing might actually be able to tell us if somebody is perhaps a few years away from showing symptoms of Alzheimer's disease or another dementia, which could be really important for clinical trials, for care, and for future planning. I'm going to finish. I've got a few more slides. I'll finish shortly. Before I do, I just wanted to flag a new study that we've just recently been funded to conduct. It's funded jointly by the Royal National Institute for Deaf People and by Alzheimer's Research UK. And we'll be running this in collaboration with Professor Patrick Naylor and Dr. Emily de Olner at Imperial College London. We're really excited about this work, and I could probably do a whole presentation about what we've got planned, which I won't. But just to mention a few things that we're doing, we'll be looking to trial a hearing training program that we hope might help to improve some of the problems that we've discussed in people with dementia. And we'll be working with the Imperial College team to help them to develop algorithms for smart hearing aids that, again, we hope will be of benefit to people with dementia in the future. I should just say we're always very keen to hear from participants, so please do get in touch with Jess if you are interested. I wanted to finish with a few concluding comments and caveats. So firstly, what I hope I've demonstrated to you in this talk is that different dementias affect different parts of the hearing brain. I should say that if you're worried about your hearing, and I imagine that might be the case for some of you watching this today, you should speak to your GP and they may refer you to an audiologist. But I'd also advise you to have a look at some of the resources on the Royal National Institute for Deaf People's website. There's a lot of really helpful information there. If on the other hand, you're worried about your thinking or your memory, again, speak to your GP and they might refer you to a specialist like a neurologist or a psychiatrist. And again, I'd also point you to the Alzheimer's Research UK website, which has a huge amount of helpful information there as well. And my final point is, because I really don't want to sort of be scaremongering here, my final point is just to say that the majority of people with hearing loss will not go on to develop dementia. And what we need to do in the scientific community is to find out why it is that some people will and some people won't. And that's work that will be ongoing. So watch this space. So just to finish that out, I'll quickly acknowledge our funders down at the bottom, all of the researchers involved in this work, particularly Professor Jason Warren, who leads the brain behaviour group that I'm part of. And biggest thanks of all to everyone who has taken part in our research, which I know includes some of you who are watching. So thank you so much. And thank you all for listening. And without, I think it goes straight on to our next speaker. So I'll hand over to Dr. Eithne Heffernan.
Thank you, Chris. That's a really great talk to follow on from. So I'll just bring up my slides in a moment. I'm going to tell you about the research I've been doing about dementia and hearing loss in the University of Nottingham, where I'm a senior research fellow. Okay, so hopefully you'll be able to see that now. So as I mentioned, I've been doing research about dementia and hearing loss, although a little bit different from Chris. It's mainly been involved with consulting people who have lived experience of these conditions, clinicians and researchers in the field. So just to give you a little bit more background about this topic, we know that there is this link between hearing loss and dementia, but we don't know exactly what the link is in every case for every type of hearing condition and dementia. But we do know that people who live with these conditions experience common consequences or common impacts. So that would include things like communication difficulties, social isolation, problems with employment and mental health, and with fatigue. So they have a lot in common, the two conditions. And as well as that, oftentimes the symptoms of these conditions overlap or mask one another, and this can be quite challenging for diagnosis and for management of these conditions. So for example, people with either condition can experience problems with communication or concentration. They can be uncomfortable in noisy places or want to withdraw socially. So if someone is experiencing those difficulties, sometimes it can be difficult to tell for a clinician or for a relative whether that's due to a problem with hearing or a problem with cognition or memory, or whether it's a combination of the two factors. So I'll just tell you about a study I've completed recently. And the aim of that study was to set an agenda for future research about dementia and hearing conditions, because we need to start by building a foundation for future research in this field by consulting people who are experts in the area to find out what do they want to research, what do they think is the most important things to focus on. So I carried out focus groups and interviews, and that was with people who live with dementia and or hearing conditions, their relatives and families, health professionals and researchers who work in this area. And they told me what their priorities were for research. So of course, one of the major priorities was to look at what are the different hearing conditions and auditory symptoms that people living with dementia experience. How common are they? When do they occur? Does hearing loss come first or does dementia come first? What are the causes and the mechanisms that explain the relationship between these two conditions? And they recommended that we don't just look at hearing loss, which is a very common condition. We should also look at other things like tinnitus or hyperacusis. Hyperacusis refers to being sensitive to certain tones or sounds to a point where it can really disrupt your everyday life. It can be really painful or uncomfortable. And also many people with dementia experience auditory hallucinations. So there are many different kind of hearing symptoms or conditions related to dementia. This is a quote from a woman I spoke to who said, "I've vascular dementia and Alzheimer's. My first sense to be affected was my hearing. Certain tones physically hurt my ears. A wonderful audiologist programmed my hearing aids to dull the tones. I was walking in a different world." Another priority that we found was to figure out what's the best way to assess hearing in people who live with dementia. Do we need to adapt our current tests? And as well as that, what's the best way to assess cognition and memory in people who live with hearing loss? And also, how and when should we discuss dementia risk with people who live with hearing loss? Because there's still a lot we have to figure out about it. So what's the best way to communicate that? A big priority was to improve post-diagnostic support for people who live with dementia. And one of the main recommendations was that because hearing is so involved, they should have a hearing assessment, and we should figure out what are their hearing and communication needs and how can we support this. This is a gentleman who told me, "I was only 55 when diagnosed with dementia. I lost my job, I lost my driving license, I lost 32 years worth of friends. You're just basically left by yourself. Dementia affects my visual awareness, it affects my hearing, it affects my mobility. You don't know where to go." So another priority that people had was that we need to develop interventions or treatments that support the social and mental well-being of people who live with these conditions. They also wanted suitable audiology interventions or hearing treatments for people living with dementia. And they also want us to ensure that current dementia care and treatments are suitable for people who live with hearing conditions. For example, making sure that music therapy is suitable for people who have hearing loss and hyperacusis. And another key priority was training for health and social care professionals and for families, because many people don't have a good understanding of hearing conditions or of dementia. So we need better education and training. We also need to tackle the stigma and the misconceptions surrounding these conditions. A lot of people don't understand what it's actually like to live with them. And we need clinical environments that are dementia friendly and hearing friendly. So our next step in this research is something that's called a James Lind Alliance Priority Setting Partnership, or JLA-PSP. And we're really excited about this. It's specifically focusing on dementia and hearing conditions, and it's funded by Alzheimer's Research UK and RNID. So the aim of the JLA-PSP is to identify the most important unanswered questions about dementia and hearing conditions. And this will be used to guide future research in this field. So it will kind of set priorities for future trials and future studies that look at this area. And there are several key steps in the process. It will be led by people who have lived experience of hearing conditions and/or dementia and clinicians who work in this area. And we'll be asking people to take part in surveys and in a workshop to figure out what are the top 10 priorities for research in this area and questions that haven't already been answered by the research that we need to focus on in the future. So it's a very exciting prospect. I'll briefly tell you about another study that I've done, which looked at current pathways for people living with dementia in audiology services. And so for this, I surveyed and interviewed audiologists in the UK and also did workshops with people who have lived experience of these conditions. These are some of their recommendations for how people living with dementia should be treated or be cared for in audiology services. So of course they recommended person-centered care, that we should involve carers in their treatment, but it should be in an appropriate, suitable manner. That we need to collaborate with other services, so audiology needs to link in with, for example, general practitioners and care homes and the council. And also audiology clinics need to be dementia friendly. As well, we need to figure out how to test hearing in people living with dementia. Do we need to adjust our tests or have different tests? And it's the same with our interventions. How should we adjust hearing aids to suit people with dementia? Do we need alternative options or devices for them? We also need to be accommodating of the fact that they may miss appointments or lose their hearing aids. And we also need to have flexible appointment lengths to suit their individual needs. Some challenges to providing good care for people with dementia in audiology include that there's quite limited training in dementia for audiologists, and there also aren't many guidelines or standards yet that they can rely on. Some clinics have a specialist pathway for people with dementia, but some don't. Also, a very small number of clinics don't provide hearing aids to people living with mild cognitive impairment or dementia, but that's not necessarily what's recommended in the scientific literature. And finally, I'll just very quickly tell you about our new study, which aims to co-design a toolkit of resources and strategies to improve the inclusion of underserved groups in dementia and hearing research. So we know that research in this area often, or in healthcare research in general, often doesn't have good representation from minority groups, such as ethnic minority groups. And we need to improve their representation in research. So to do that, we'll be going through several stages, including carrying out focus groups and workshops to co-design the toolkit and have a celebration event at the end. So I just want to thank the team who have been part of this research, including our experts by experience and our students, and our collaborators and funders as well. So thank you very much for listening to my talk. I'm going to hand back over to Josie for the Q&A session now.
Thank you, Eithne. That was really brilliant talk. And I'd like to welcome Chris back to the screen as well as we start the Q&A. Thank you both for those really interesting talks. That's really brilliant. And we've had loads of questions coming through the chat already. So do keep typing your questions in the box and we'll try and get through as many as we can. We've probably got about 20-25 minutes to move through some questions. So Chris, I might start with you. We've got a question from Megan who said, "Hi Chris, you mentioned that we may perhaps be able to make assumptions on the type of hearing loss that people with different types of dementia have. I was just wondering if you are aware of any evidence regarding hearing loss in dementia with Lewy bodies or Parkinson's dementia. So obviously you mentioned frontotemporal dementia, PCA. Do you know of anything about Lewy bodies or Parkinson's?"
Yes, thank you for the question. It's a really great question. So I say I've not done any research myself or been involved with any research myself. However, I'm aware there is a small body of literature suggesting that people with neurodegenerative conditions that fall within the sort of the Lewy body disease spectrum do have auditory, what we call central or brain related auditory processing difficulties. I think they're quite diverse range of things that are reported for people within that spectrum. So things like what we call auditory scene processing. So that, like that dinner party example I put on one of my slides, but also more fundamental things like tone and rhythm processing. And of course, as Eithne mentioned in her talk, things like auditory hallucinations are more likely perhaps in dementia with Lewy bodies than some other conditions. But I should caveat all of that by saying that I wasn't involved in any of that work myself.
Thanks. Yeah. I think if Megan, if you wanted to find out more about that, we'll pop a link and the email address for our dementia research info line. That's the same for any question that we go through. If you want to find out anything more that we talk about, just drop our info line team an email or give them a call, and they'll be able to get back to you with an answer on any of those things. So perhaps a question for both of you. Chris asks, does tinnitus, with or without hearing loss, has this been investigated along with the links between deafness and hearing loss? I think, Eithne, you touched on that a little bit.
Yes, my own research is mainly focused on hearing loss, so we're just starting to look at tinnitus, but my colleagues in Nottingham do a lot of research on tinnitus, so it's something we're very interested in. The links between tinnitus and dementia aren't as well understood. There's been a little bit of research in this area, but there's a long way to go. We know that tinnitus is linked to hearing loss, although not everyone has both conditions. You can have hearing loss without tinnitus, and you can have tinnitus without maybe hearing loss, but there's a link between those two. And then we know hearing loss is linked to dementia, so I guess people would expect maybe it's linked to dementia, but it's not as clear as the link between hearing loss and dementia. So at the moment, I think we don't fully understand, and I've spoken to audiologists who say they find it difficult with patients living with dementia sometimes to tell whether the person is describing tinnitus or whether they're describing an auditory hallucination, because they might not be able to describe exactly what they're experiencing if they have dementia. So I think that's something that needs a lot more work. I don't know, Chris, if you have anything you wanted to add.
Thank you. Only that, well, two things. So firstly, I have tinnitus, so I appreciate how frustrating and how annoying it is. And secondly, that it has been some work from the research group that I work in, suggesting that people with another rare form of dementia known as semantic dementia, or the semantic variant of primary progressive aphasia, seem to have people with this condition seem to have report having tinnitus and hyperacusis, which is another thing that Eithne mentions in her talk. So this increased sensitivity to sound than we would expect. So more people with that condition reporting those additional problems, which is really quite strange, because this is a condition that is primarily affects semantic memory. So our knowledge of that we accumulate about the world throughout our lifetimes, of who people are, of what things are, what things do. And so for it to be associated with this quite fundamental hearing problem as well is quite interesting. And I don't think we fully understand the causes of that yet.
Great, thanks so much both. That was really brilliant answers. So I think Zoe asked at the beginning, actually, before we'd started the talk, so I'm not sure if we might be able to answer this question or not. So Zoe said that both of their parents lost their sense of smell before being diagnosed with dementia or brain function loss, and both were also deaf. Are the two linked? To either of you?
Well, sense of smell isn't my area of expertise. I have seen, just briefly when I was doing some reading, that there is some research to indicate that losing a sense of smell might be one of the early signs of developing dementia, potentially Alzheimer's. But yeah, smell isn't my area of expertise, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think that's
the question.
Sort of, are the two are sense of smell and then hearing loss or deafness, are they linked? I think you're very correct, Eithne, in saying that loss of sense of smell is a really early symptom, so perhaps that it's often one that's missed as well, so perhaps it's more that was a separate thing to the deafness. But again, not sure. Do get in touch with that info line for that one. That did come through before we'd started our talk, so perhaps we didn't quite get to cover that topic. So let me find another one. Caroline asks, just to clarify, does your research knock the idea on the head that hearing loss leads to dementia, but more that hearing loss is a symptom, or rather maybe a byproduct of dementia due to the dementia's impact on brain function? Chris, I think that came through during your talks, or just after your talk, actually.
Yeah, thank you. It's another great question. And no is the answer. I should have made this clear. I'm really sorry that the three theories that I talked about, which are three of many, they're not mutually exclusive. So, so I think it is fair to say, and I think we've got a large body of work suggesting that dementia can cause hearing problems, hearing changes due to neurodegenerative processes in the brain. That doesn't sort of debunk this association the other way round. I think the jury is possibly still out about exactly how that relationship between hearing loss at the level of the ear and then dementia, which is obviously a brain pathology, how those two are linked. And I think it's really vital for this field that we get some answers to that in the next few years. But to answer the question, a firm no, it does not debunk that. No.
Great. Thanks, Chris. I'm just going to go to one of the questions that we had pre-submitted before the event today as well. So if dementia is associated with early hearing loss, would it help if one uses a hearing aid? Eithne, perhaps that's one for you.
I think we don't know yet exactly. It's certainly an area of research that's ongoing, and there have been various studies and various trials looking at the benefits of hearing aids in either people who have dementia or mild cognitive impairment, or maybe just the general population, and looking at, or people with hearing loss, and looking at how it affects their cognition. And there have been some positive results like that suggest, for example, if you have dementia, wearing hearing aids might improve your functioning, but then there have also been conflicting results. I mean, the research does suggest that in general, there are benefits to wearing hearing aids. So in general, they can improve your quality of life and can improve your listening ability. So in general, people are encouraged to wear them if possible. And also there's an idea that it's a good idea to be fitted with hearing aids early on, because a lot of people put off getting their hearing tested and then put off getting hearing aids, for various reasons. But if you got them fitted early, then you would get used to them, you'd acclimatize to them, and if you did go on to develop dementia, which, as Chris said, not everyone will, but if you did, then at least you'd have already adapted to your hearing aids. And it's much harder when you develop dementia to get used to something new. So there's a lot of benefits potentially to wearing them, but I think, we need to do more research to look at how does it affect cognition? Does it change the rate of cognitive decline? That kind of thing. And again, with different dementias, does it affect different dementias differently? I think, Chris, you'd probably like to add to that.
Oh, thank you. I think that's a brilliant answer. Yeah, just to reiterate what you said, I think there is some evidence suggesting that they can have either help with cognition or perhaps even slow sort of or delay onset of dementia. I think I'm thinking about sort of my tortuous iceberg analogy. You can to think about that if you imagine that somebody who has who develops hearing loss, who doesn't wear hearing aids, perhaps their level of symptom onset, because their brains are having to work harder, perhaps that comes slightly down below the level of the water, and perhaps hearing aids, if they're fitted properly, if the person's brain has adapted to them, perhaps that can push that symptom onset back up. I think what we really need to, as Eithne said, is proper clinical trials. I think potentially one issue with the way that research has been conducted in this area so far is that what tends to happen is we'll take a group of people who have hearing loss who don't wear hearing aids and compare them to a group of people who have hearing loss who do wear hearing aids, and then follow them up and see how many in each group develop dementia subsequently. But I think this is acknowledged by the people who do this research, I think a potential problem there is that perhaps there's something quite special about that group of people who have hearing loss but are not wearing hearing aids, and as Eithne says, we know that people with cognitive difficulties perhaps find it harder to wear hearing aids. So is it possible that that subgroup of people actually already have maybe a preclinical neurodegenerative process, which is why they're not able to derive the benefit from hearing aids, and why they don't wear them in the first place? So I think I completely agree. I think hearing aids, talking to an audiologist, receiving hearing aids and wearing them early is likely to be a really good thing. What I don't think we necessarily know is the exact mechanism through which they're working.
Great answers, thank you both. We've actually had a message from Deb in the Q&A who says, as an audiologist, I feel early aiding is really important for people living with dementia, and I'm hoping more of these sorts of studies become more well known and that more people will get their hearing tested earlier. So thank you, Deb, for that comment. Perfectly rounded off that discussion there. I think we know that it takes people, you know, up to 10 years to go and get their hearing tested when they from when they first notice those early signs. So yeah, definitely early hearing testing is important. We had a question come through from Steve and Linda, who asked, well, they say it was great to see imaging of different areas of the brain affected by dementias and the different effect that this had on hearing. And they wanted to know, were cochlear hair cells the health of those cochlear hair cells also looked at, or do either of you know anything about any studies into that?
I can say that we didn't really look at that in relation to our brain imaging work, and I should sort of be clear about my expertise or lack thereof. I'm really not a hearing expert in the traditional sense. I come at this from a psychology or more of a psychology perspective. In terms of, we tend to use a pure tone audiometry as an assay of cochlear function, which is sort of the I don't want to say anything correct that Deb, the qualified audiologist, will correct me on saying, but I think it's fair to say is a mainstay of audiological assessment, and is traditionally used perhaps to index cochlear function. So we try to sort of explore the differential contributions of crudely ear-related cochlear hearing loss versus the hearing loss we're seeing in the brain. Yeah. Great,
thank you. I'm just checking through some more of the questions that we've had. So Hilary has asked, have you come across any connection between balance problems also implicating the labyrinth in the ear due to neuronitis and dementia? Do either of you know anything about that? We can move on if not.
I don't know about that specifically. I'm sorry, I don't know about neuronitis.
Yeah, I think we're sort of discussing today that this is such a broad topic, and there's so much that we could have delved into just in this discussion today. So definitely shows that this is really an area of research that definitely needs more work and more discoveries to be made.
It is a big area of interest because the ear is the organ of balance as well as hearing. So, you know, if depending on where the damage occurs, there could be a link, you know, and we do know that people with dementia are at risk for falls, you know, at a heightened risk and things like that, and frailty and balance problems. So you would imagine that is connected, but it's not something I've specifically researched myself.
Thanks, Eithne.
Yeah, and just I was just gonna add to that and say again, it's not something I've researched myself, but a colleague and collaborator of mine, Dr. Kier Yong, researches balance problems due to brain changes, primarily in people with Alzheimer's disease and posterior cortical atrophy as well, which is the visual-led dementia that I mentioned in my slides. And he's shown that people with both conditions do have these problems with balance. So yeah, in the same way that we've shown that they have problems with central or complex hearing as well.
Thank you. Steffi asked, Hi, Chris. I'm curious about hearing loss and cognitive decline in individuals with ADHD or similar neurodiversity. Has there been any data to suggest any links or deviations? Many thanks.
I don't know, to be honest. Yeah, sorry.
No worries. I think as I said, this is such a broad and amazingly detailed topic that we've sort of really just got the tip of the iceberg, to use Chris's wonderful analogy. So yeah, definitely do get in touch with our information services team if you want any more in-depth answers. They can pull together different studies for you, summarize complex papers, so do get in touch with them, and also the RNID as well. I'll be sharing links at the end to all of this information for you.
I think there is a link between some of the neurodivergent conditions and some hearing symptoms like hyperacusis, that sensitivity to certain tones and sounds, but in terms of its connection to something like cognitive decline or dementia, I don't know. And I don't know if there's actually been much research in that area.
Thanks, Eithne. Perhaps we'll have one more question from Bo, which has just come through. It's quite a long one, so bear with me while I read it out. So, hi, I have been told by an audiologist that wearing hearing aids to help stimulate parts of the brain that deals with hearing, so delays dementia, plus relying on subtitles, e.g. on the TV, also works against keeping the auditory parts of the brain stimulated and active, and they would be interested in your opinions. Thank you. Any thoughts?
Do you want to go first, Chris?
Yeah, just say I think that all sounds broadly sensible. Not a clinician, not an audiologist, but yeah, I think that I think it makes sense that keeping your brain active is likely to be helpful. Our brains are remarkably what we call plastic in that they can adapt to quite major issues. So if you think about somebody who's had a stroke, for instance, parts of the healthy brain can be sort of co-opted to perform functions that were previously performed by parts of the damaged brain. So yeah, I think it makes sense that the brain can adapt to altered sensory processing, like the altered incoming information you'll get via a hearing aid. And I think, as Eithne said, the important thing there is to make sure that you start as early as you can, really, with that.
Yeah, I'm not a clinician either, but I guess that the audiologist is basing that advice on, there's a couple of hypotheses that still need to be fully tested about perhaps the link between hearing and cognitive decline or dementia. Is that if you've hearing loss, you're not getting enough auditory stimulation and input, and that's maybe not keeping your brain active, or also you might not be getting enough social engagement to kind of stimulate you and keep your brain active. So if you wore hearing aids, it would help address that, and you would get enough stimulation to kind of maybe keep things healthy. I don't think there's anything wrong with reading subtitles on the telly, but maybe they were kind of suggesting you don't want to just completely cut off your hearing senses. If there was, a way that you could keep that active, if that's something you're interested in doing, or kind of keep both things going. But yeah, they're just hypotheses, I guess, at this stage. But we do know that things like social isolation is also a risk factor for dementia. So that and hearing loss together, you want to kind of minimize those things. So in that sense, it's, we know there's benefits to wearing hearing aids to improve that and to improve your listening abilities and improve your quality of life. So it's, I guess, a good thing to give them a go anyway.
Great. Thanks so much, both. That sort of really nicely brings us to the end of our Q&A. So I'll finish with one question for you both each, which is, what are you most excited for in the future of research, dementia research, or research in your field? Chris, I'll go with you first.
Oh, thank you. I'll be cheeky enough to say one in general is, I'm sure people watching would have seen the news about the drug lecanemab, which it looks like it's it's a really exciting development in Alzheimer's research, and potentially the first drug that actually modifies the underlying course of the disease and has clinical benefits as well. I should caveat that by saying that, that there's some issues with it, and Alzheimer's Research UK have done some really nice write-ups about why it's not sort of a panacea. In my own research, what I'm really excited about is having this funding from, again, from Alzheimer's Research UK and from the Royal National Institute for Deaf People. As a scientist, one of the most frustrating things is writing funding applications, and you have these brilliant ideas, or you think they're brilliant ideas, and the funders don't always agree with you. And so really excited about that work, and also one other study which is still under embargo. We haven't finished the signing of the contracts yet, but that will be a sort of a 4-year prospective longitudinal study in collaboration with Dr. Charles Marshall at Queen Mary University of London, and in that we'll be sort of following a large cohort of people with mild cognitive impairment up longitudinally to see if we can use our tests of complex hearing to predict, in combination with protein tests, to predict who goes on to develop dementia. So hopefully to really answer those questions about how is hearing loss and dementia related. So that's my two.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Eithne, same question to you. What are you most excited for the future of dementia research?
There's a couple of things. I myself was a carer for a loved one with dementia and hearing loss, so I am quite excited about research that looks at, supporting families, the person themselves and their relatives, and finding ways to kind of improve their quality of life, because things like reducing risk and prevention are important, but we also need to look after people who already live with these conditions, who already experience them. And then I think I'm also interested in improving maybe the diagnosis of dementia, because a lot of people may not know which type of dementia they have, or it's very difficult to tell sometimes, while the person is with us, what type of dementia they have, or some people have more than one. And I think that would help research a lot if we could get a better understanding of all the different types of dementia. There might be some that we don't even fully understand yet. And then also, finally, our upcoming, big mouthful, James Lind Alliance Priority Setting Partnership for Dementia and Hearing Research, because as we've seen today from all the questions, there's so many things we need to look at. It's still quite a new area, and this project would get people who actually live with these conditions and clinicians to tell us, this is what you need to focus on, this is what's important to us, this is what we're interested to get answered, and then we can base our research and our trials on that. So we need that foundation, I think.
Great. Thanks so much, both. That was really, really brilliant. And yeah, I'll just say goodbye to you both and thank you so much for joining us. A really, really brilliant talks, and thank you for answering all our questions as well. I think, Chris, Jessica's email has been shared in the chat, but Eithne, if you had that contact information that you wanted to share, if you pop it in the chat, then great. Everybody can see that. But yeah,
actually, I think the person who had a question about tinnitus, if you do want to get in touch, I've lots of colleagues who look at that, so I'll be happy to pass a query on.
Fab, thank you. So I'll say goodbye to you both now, and then I'll share a few of our closing slides at the end. So bye bye.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
So before you go as well, we've just got a really quick couple of poll questions that we'd love you to answer, just to give us a bit of an insight into how you found today. And then you can also see on the screen now is the Dementia Research info line. So if you could quickly answer those poll questions, and then we'll just wrap up the session today. So the first one is, was the content of the talks too technical, about right, or too simple? And would you recommend lab notes to your family and friends? And have you learned something new about dementia research today? I definitely have. I didn't really know very much about hearing loss and dementia, so I've learned loads and loads today from these really brilliant discussions. So in a sec, we'll just share those results back with you so you can see those answers. Fab, they should be on your screen now, and we'll move through our closing slides. So I know that there were some questions that we weren't able to answer today, and some where you might need some more personal information or guidance on where to turn. And our Dementia Research info line is there to help. So they can answer questions and signpost to other sources of information and support. So please do get in touch with them. And if you need any further support and advice or have specific questions about hearing loss, then you can get in touch with the Royal National Institute for Deaf People with that link at the top, the Contact Us link. And you can also have a look at their website for more information as well. And they also have a free online hearing test too. And I know today we've talked a little bit about participating in research. So Eithne and Chris have been very kind to share their contact information for their colleagues and to get in touch. But if you are interested in finding out more about other dementia research, you can look at our Join Dementia Research service, which can match you to clinical research studies. And this is open to anyone over the age of 18, and you do not need a dementia diagnosis to take part in these studies. So you can find out more and sign up to Join Dementia Research on the website there on the screen. And finally, we would love to hear what you thought about today's event in a little bit more detail. So we've done that quick poll, but we'd like a little bit more detail. So there is a QR code on the screen there for you to scan and fill out our short survey. And there'll also be a link in the chat, and it will also be in a link in the email after the event. And as I said, this is our 20th Lab Notes event. So if you've missed any of our previous events, you can watch them back in your own time, as they are all available on our Lab Notes webpage or over on our YouTube channel. And that's it from me. Thank you so much for joining us today. I hope you found it interesting and useful, and we hope to see you again soon. Thanks everyone. Bye.